I woke up from emergency surgery on a Thursday morning, and the first thing I saw was my unit. Not one person, not my commanding officer sent as a representative with the standard condolence protocol. All of them. Every member of my 12-person unit standing in the corridor outside my hospital room window in dress uniform, perfectly still, not talking, not looking at their phones, not doing any of the things that people do when they are waiting in a corridor for something to happen. Just standing, in dress uniform, in a row. I had been a military intelligence officer for 12 years. I had been in this unit for 4 of them. I knew these people. Knew them in the specific, complete way that you know people you have worked alongside in conditions that reveal character. I knew how each of them stood when they were relaxed and how each of them stood when they were not. I knew the difference between the way Sergeant Morrison held his shoulders on an ordinary Tuesday and the way he held them when something had happened that required the specific, professional bearing that the situation demanded. They were all holding their shoulders the way Sergeant Morrison held his when something had happened. I understood before any of them said Marcus's name. I started crying, not because of pain. The surgery had been significant and the pain was real and present, but it was not what produced the tears. I started crying because I had been a soldier for 12 years, and I knew what a unit standing in dress uniform in a hospital corridor meant, and I had understood it the moment I saw them, and the understanding arrived before I had the protection of not knowing. I knew. I lay in that hospital bed and I looked at my unit through the window and I cried before anyone had said Marcus's name. I need to tell you about the 48 hours before I woke up, because the hospital room is not where this story begins. I had been on base on a Tuesday when I collapsed. Not dramatically, not the cinematic collapse of someone who has been shot or who has sustained obvious trauma. The specific, sudden, internally originating collapse of someone whose body has been managing something significant without external announcement, and who has finally reached the point where management is no longer possible. I was in my office, I was reviewing a report, I put down my pen, and then I was on the floor, and Sergeant Morrison was calling for medical assistance, and I was no longer in a condition to contribute to what was happening around me. The surgery was emergency, an internal condition that had been building, and that had chosen a Tuesday in July to become critical. The medical team was thorough and fast, and the outcome was, by the time I woke up on Thursday morning, what the surgeon would describe to me as the best we could have hoped for. I had been unconscious or sedated for approximately 40 hours. In those 40 hours, the world had continued without me, and something had happened in it. The nurse who had been monitoring me noticed I was awake within minutes. She came into the room. She was the specific kind of calm that nurses are when they have information they need to deliver carefully and who have assessed, in the moment of entry, how the person receiving it appears to be doing. She said, "Captain Hartley, welcome back. How are you feeling?" I said, "The corridor." She said, "I'm sorry?" I said, "My unit, in the corridor. Tell me." She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who had been prepared for this conversation and who was now having it sooner than anticipated. She said, "Your husband was notified when you were admitted on Tuesday. He drove immediately. He was here within 3 hours." I said, "Where is Marcus?" She said, "Captain, I am so sorry." I want to tell you about the next 4 minutes, because 4 minutes is how long I lay in that bed before I made my first decision. 4 minutes in which I held what the nurse had told me. Marcus had driven 3 hours to be here. He had been notified that I was in emergency surgery, and he had gotten in his car and driven to me. And somewhere in the 3 hours between our home and this hospital, something had happened, and my unit was in the corridor in dress uniform. The dress uniform was the thing my mind kept returning to in those 4 minutes. Dress uniform means something specific. It is not what you wear when you are visiting a colleague in hospital. It is not what you wear when you are showing support for a fellow soldier's family member. Dress uniform means the formal institutional acknowledgement of something that requires the formal institutional acknowledgement of the military. I knew what it meant.
I had known from the first moment I saw them. 4 minutes. Then I pressed the call button. The nurse came back. I said, "I need you to let them in." She said, "Captain, you've just come out of major surgery. The doctor recommends—" I said, "Please, let them in." She looked at me. She said, "I'll get them." Sergeant Morrison came in first. He is a large man, tall, broad, the specific physical presence of someone who has been in operational environments that select for it. I had seen him in many situations over 4 years. I had seen him focused and tired and amused, and occasionally, in the specific moments that produce it, moved. I had seen him in every register that 4 years of working alongside someone produces. I had not seen his face do what it did when he walked into my room. He stopped at the foot of my bed. He said, "Morrison." I said, "Morrison." He said, "We came as soon as—" I said, "I know, I saw you." He said, "All of us wanted to—" I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the voice of someone who has rehearsed something and who is finding the rehearsal inadequate, "Marcus was—" I said, "Tell me exactly, please." He told me.
Marcus had been 40 minutes from the hospital when the accident occurred. A junction, another vehicle. The specific terrible contingency of 2 things happening at exactly the same time in exactly the same place that produce outcomes that should not have been possible, and that were. He had been transported to a different facility, not this one, a trauma center 20 minutes from where the accident happened, which was 40 minutes from where I was. He had been in surgery within the hour. He had not survived the surgery. Morrison told me this in the careful, measured way that people who have been soldiers for a long time tell things that require care and measure. He did not soften it beyond what the care required. 4 years of working together had given him that knowledge, and he used it. When he finished, I was quiet for a long time. The room was very still. Morrison standing at the foot of the bed, the sound of the monitors, the corridor visible through the window where the rest of the unit was still standing. I said, "Our children." Morrison said, "Your sister has them. She came last night. They don't know yet. She was waiting for you to be awake." I said, "How long has she had them?" He said, "Since Tuesday evening." I said, "She's been with them since Tuesday evening." He said, "Yes, ma'am." I thought about my sister Rachel arriving at our house on Tuesday evening to collect 2 children who did not yet know what had happened. I thought about the specific, enormous task of being present for children in that situation, keeping them calm, keeping things normal enough, holding the information until their mother was conscious enough to be the one to give it. I said, "I need to call her." Morrison said, "Of course." He started to reach for his phone to hand to me. I said, "Morrison." He said, "Ma'am." I said, "Thank you for coming, for bringing them all." He said, "There was no question about it. There was never a question." I said, "I know." I called Rachel from Morrison's phone. She answered on the first ring. She said my name in the voice of someone who has been waiting for a call for 36 hours and who was both relieved and devastated to receive it. I said, "I'm awake. I know about Marcus." She said, "Claire." I said, "How are they?" She said, They're okay. They're with me. They don't know. I didn't know what to—" I said, "You did exactly right. I'll tell them. I need to be the one to tell them." She said, "When can you?" I said, "I don't know yet. The doctor hasn't spoken to me, but soon, as soon as I can." She said, "They've been asking for you. I've been telling them you're at the hospital having something fixed and that you'll be home soon." I said, "That's exactly right. That's exactly what you should have told them." She said, "Claire, I'm so sorry." I said, "I know. Tell them I called. Tell them I'm awake and I love them and I'll see them soon." She said, "I will." I said, "Rachel." She said, "Yes." I said, "Thank you for being there." She said, "There's nowhere else I would be." The doctor came at 10:30. She was thorough and direct in the way of someone who has learned that directness is what people in this situation need. She told me about the surgery, what had been done, what the recovery timeline looked like, what I could expect in the coming days and weeks.
She told me I was going to be fine. She said it in the specific way of someone who means it medically and who also understands that fine is a complicated word for someone who has just been told what I had been told. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "When can I leave?" She said, "Captain." I said, "I have 2 children who don't know their father is dead. I need to be the one to tell them. When can I leave?" She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Not today. The surgery was significant and the recovery requires—" I said, "Tomorrow." She said, "If your numbers hold through tonight, tomorrow afternoon, against my recommendation for the full timeline, but I understand the circumstances." I said, "Thank you." She said, "You'll need someone with you. You cannot drive." I said, "I have 12 people in the corridor." She said, "Yes, I noticed."
They stayed all day. Not all of them continuously, they rotated in and out as the day required, the way that soldiers manage situations that require sustained presence. But there was always someone in the corridor, always someone available if I needed anything. Always the specific collective presence of people who had decided that being there was what the situation required, and who were doing it without being asked and without expectation. Sergeant Morrison sat with me for an hour in the afternoon. We did not talk much. We had not always needed to talk. 4 years of working alongside someone in conditions that matter builds a quality of companionship that does not require conversation to be present. At one point, he said, "He was a good man, Marcus, the times I met him. He was a genuinely good man." I said, "He was." Morrison said, "He drove 3 hours the moment he heard." I said, "I know." Morrison said, "That's who he was." I said, "Yes." We sat in the quiet for a while. Then I said, "Morrison, the children. Emma is 9 and James is 7. I need to tell them tomorrow." He said, "I know." I said, "I don't know how to tell them." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You'll know when you're there. You always know when you're there." I said, "I'm not sure that's true this time." He said, "It will be. They're your mother. You'll know." I looked at the window, the corridor, the afternoon light coming through at the angle it comes at this hour in July. I said, "Why are you all in dress uniform?" He said, "Because Marcus was driving to you. Because of why he was driving to you. Because he was—" He stopped, started again. "Because it was the right thing." I said, "It was the right thing." He said, "Yes, ma'am." Lieutenant Chen came in the early evening. She was the youngest member of the unit, 26, 2 years in, the specific combination of capability and enthusiasm that produces good officers when it's developed well, and which I had been working with for the year since she joined us. She sat in the chair beside my bed, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Captain, can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "How do you do it? How are you this calm?" I looked at her. She said, "I don't mean it disrespectfully. You found out this morning, and you've been here all day, and you've been—" I said, "I'm not calm." She said, "You seem—" I said, "Chen, I am not calm. What I am is functional. Those are different things." She said, "What's the difference?" I said, "Calm means the thing isn't there. Functional means the thing is completely there and you are doing what needs doing anyway." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "How do you do that?" I said, 12 years of practice and the understanding that the things that need doing are still the things that need doing regardless of what you're feeling while you do them." I said, "My children need me tomorrow. That is what needs doing. Everything else I am feeling, and I am feeling everything, Chen, all of it, is going to be there. It is going to take a long time, and it is going to be the hardest thing I have ever done." I said, "But tomorrow, I need to be there for my children. So tonight, I am going to sleep, and tomorrow, I am going to go home." She nodded slowly. She said, "I want to be like that someday." I said, "You already are. You just haven't needed it yet." Morrison drove me home the following afternoon. He had offered,
I had accepted without discussion, because accepting without discussion was the right response to an offer made by someone who had spent the day in a corridor in dress uniform, because it was the right thing. We drove mostly in silence, the same road Marcus had driven on Tuesday, the same towns, the same junctions, the same 40 minutes. I did not think about Tuesday. I thought about Emma and James waiting at Rachel's house. I thought about their faces and what their faces were going to do when I told them. I thought about what words I was going to use, and whether any words were adequate, and whether adequacy was even the measure. Morrison did not try to fill the silence. This was one of the things I had valued about him for 4 years, his understanding of when silence was what was needed. At one point, about 20 minutes from Rachel's house, he said, "Captain." I said, "Morrison." He said, "For what it's worth, the unit, everyone, we're here. Whatever you need, however long, we're here." I said, "I know." He said, "Marcus drove 3 hours." I said, "Yes." He said, "We'll drive however far it takes, for as long as it takes. That's what we're saying." I looked out the window at the July afternoon. I said, "That means more than I know how to say." He said, "You don't have to say it." We drove the rest of the way in silence. I told Emma and James that afternoon, "I am not going to give you the words I used, because they belong to the 3 of us and they are not mine to share. What I will tell you is what Morrison said was true. I knew when I was there. The words came from the right place, and they landed in the way that words can land when they are true, and when the person saying them loves the people hearing them completely." Emma cried immediately, the full, unguarded grief of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned to manage the expression of it. James was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in the careful voice of a 7-year-old who is being very serious, "Is Daddy coming back?" I said, "No, baby, Daddy isn't coming back." He said, "Because he died." I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." And then he climbed into my lap, carefully, because I had explained that I had had an operation and that I needed to be careful, and he put his head against my shoulder and he was quiet. I held them both. Rachel sat across from us, and she did not say anything, and she did not need to. I want to say something about my unit standing in the corridor. 12 people, dress uniform, perfectly still. Not one of them on their phones, not one of them talking. They had driven from the base. Some of them had driven 2 hours to stand in a hospital corridor in dress uniform for a woman who was unconscious and could not see them, and for a man who was already gone. They had stood there through Tuesday evening and Wednesday and Thursday morning until I woke up, because it was the right thing. Not because they were ordered to, not because it was in any protocol or regulation or institutional expectation, because they had decided, as a group, or perhaps individually and then as a group, that being present was what the situation required. When I opened my eyes on Thursday morning and looked through the window and saw them standing there, all of them in dress uniform, perfectly still, I understood before anyone spoke, because I knew what it meant. And I also knew something else that I have thought about many times since. I knew that I was not alone. Not in the clinical sense. There were medical staff, there was the monitor, there was the morning, but in the deeper sense. The sense that matters when the thing that has happened is the kind of thing that makes alone feel like the only possible condition. I was not alone. Because 12 people drove to a hospital corridor and stood in dress uniform and waited. Because Morrison told me things exactly the right way. Because Chen asked the right question. Because Rachel had my children and told them I was having something fixed and that I would be home soon. Because the things that need doing are still the things that need doing, and the people who help you do them are the people who matter. She doesn't stay silent, she doesn't stay broken, she rises. Sometimes rising is waking up from surgery and understanding something devastating before anyone says a word, and then pressing the call button and saying, "Let them in." Subscribe. New story every week, and every single one of them ends the same way. She rises. Leave a comment. Has someone ever shown up for you in a way that told you everything without saying a word? I read every single one.